Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. My name is Jason. This week, we are covering another novelization from Season 22. Longtime listeners of Doctor Who Literature will know that Season 22 is not my favorite era of the show, but Mark of the Rani, the TV episode, is probably my favorite episode from that season, if not my second favorite. The novelization is by two writers we have not discussed before. This is their first novelization, the husband and wife team, Pip and Jane Baker. And to discuss these first-time target authors, I have a first-time guest, Michael Storm, new to this show, but he has recently recorded appearances for several other shows, which are hosted by other people who have been guests on Doctor Who Literature. So if you follow my general circle of podcasters, you may well have heard his voice already. He has a lot of fresh takes to bring to the table, and I'm excited for you to hear them. We have a lot to discuss about Mark of the Rani, its possible origins, and lots of other works of children's literature in both the UK and the United States, including an extended discussion of one of my favorite series, The Hardy Boys. You're used to hearing a lot of the comedy and music of Jim Sangster on this show. Jim is off this week. I was given a submission by a longtime listener, Kevin from Columbus, and a very funny one, a Twilight Zone style introduction discussing this particular book. Back in episode 74, Jim Sangster had recorded a Twilight Zone intro for me, which is so good that I'm planning on using it again at a later date as appropriate. However, unfortunately, there was an audio issue importing Kevin's monologue into this episode. I can play it perfectly well outside of Audacity, but if I import it into Audacity, it is just unsalvageable. I'm not quite sure what the matter is. My apologies to Kevin, but as I assemble the edit, usually at the last minute on Saturday night, I don't have time to do the technical work to do a repair job. If I can get it done at a later date, you will hear it, and of course, hopefully you have not heard the last from Kevin from Columbus on this show. I'm releasing this episode on the Sunday of the Academy Awards ceremony. There are 10 Best Picture nominees. I have seen 7.5 of them. I thought about giving you my review of all of the movies that I have seen, but this is going to be a shorter episode, and that seemed a little self-indulgent of me. I will just say of the movies that I've seen, I think that Zone of Interest was the best, the most powerful for me. I know that's contrary to popular opinion, but I really can't recommend that one enough. It is not easy or fun viewing, but it is certainly the strongest movie that I saw. And my second favorite is going to be Past Lives, which is a love letter to New York, in one sense, and it's the story of what happens when a Korean immigrant living and working in New York and her husband receive a visit from her ex-boyfriend. This is the one that takes place in my world. I have walked a lot of the same steps in Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan as the characters in this movie do, and I have lived through a similar circumstance to what the movie describes. And then, of course, you have your usual suspects. Oppenheimer, very, very good. Poor Things, very, very good. The Holdovers was not exactly to my taste, but I am a minority opinion for everyone else that I spoke to. So if you are participating in an Oscars pool tonight, good luck. I hope your movie wins. If you are discovering this show 3 years later, well, I hope that the Academy got it right. In the meantime, after the break, we'll get to my conversation with Michael Storm, and then we'll get to my audio essay, giving you my view of the Pip and Jane novelization. Let's get to it.
A Whovian and a Nuvian walk into a TARDIS.
And explore every episode of the classic Doctor Who series.
Join me, podcaster John S. Drew,
And me, writer-editor Jim Beard, as we take apart each story starting from the very beginning in 1963.
And join us on our Facebook page and Twitter, where we continue the discussion with you with historical artifacts from British papers of the time. The Doctor's Beard Podcast, released every Saturday around tea time on your favorite podcasting app.
And we'll see you in time and space. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature. Keep turning the pages.
My guest this week is a first-time guest on Doctor Who Literature, but has already racked up an impressive series of guest spots on several other podcasts, and is working on premiering a podcast of his own. I met him on Twitter before I abandoned Twitter forever and deleted my account and salted the earth behind it, but he is still doing very good work on Twitter, I imagine. Everybody give a warm Doctor Who Literature welcome to Mr. Michael Storm. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hello, Jason. It's nice to be on the show. Long-term listener, so to speak.
So even though this is still an audio-only podcast, we are recording face-to-face on Skype, so I can see that you are wearing a shirt that marks you out as a number one fan of Doctor Who Literature. You are, of course, wearing the designed by Jim Sangster Ghastly Woke Zombie t-shirt made famous by that one guy on Apple Podcasts who gave me a 2-star rating for having guests who were, quote-unquote, ghastly woke zombies.
Well, I'm very pleased to join the army.
Had I known you were going to wear that shirt, I would have worn it myself. Mine is in the drawer. I am wearing my Stonehenge t-shirt today in honor of my first trip to the UK in 2018.
See, it was just a last-minute thought to put it on.
I am recording with Jim Sangster in a few days for a different project, so I will have to wear that shirt because Jim always wears one of his own t-shirts when we're recording.
Yes, I can imagine he would.
It's excellent advertising for him, and of course for Doctor Who Literature, to which he is an invaluable contributor. This is your first appearance on the show, but we have recorded an episode already for your podcast, which has yet to be released. Talk to us a little bit about your show and your show's themes and aims and remit.
Okay, it's entitled Side Rat Storm, as in the side rats from the War Games, and I'm going with the television pronunciation by Edwin Brayshaw, as opposed to what probably is the more accurate pronunciation given by David Troughton in the novelisation. And I'm starting off with it's mostly Doctor Who themed, but I'm linking to related TV programs and films and books. So there'll be episodes on Red Dwarf, Blake Seven, The Avengers, and when I say The Avengers, I mean Steve and Mrs. Peel, not Iron Man. And so the first series, as it is, will be my journey into fandom. I'll be starting with what will be my vaguely following the VHS purchases which launched me into fandom. So I'll be starting with Death to the Daleks, and of course, to kick off a new podcast, you have to have the ubiquitous Simon Hart, and I totally deny getting his name on in the first minute.
You know, you can't have a podcast without Simon. He's probably been on this show more than anybody else. He's probably been on more podcasts than anybody else that I know of. And, of course, now he has his own show, The Library of Impossible Things. So you don't get too far in the Doctor Who podcast sphere without bumping into Simon.
He's like Kevin Bacon. I bet you could do 6 degrees of Simon Hart.
Well, my Kevin Bacon number is 2 or 3, and my Simon Hart number is 1. So I'm going to have to clearly get closer to Kevin Bacon.
So I'm looking to launch around the same time that Shooty's first season debuts. I've got 1 or 2 episodes to record and a few minor edits to put together on 1 or 2. And so I'll be going from 5 on the Death of the Daleks up to the first Dalek serial, which is basically my first purchases on VHS. After that, they all get a bit hazy.
I can probably tell you the first 12 novelizations that I bought in order, but I was getting 2 or 3 every 2 weeks. So after the 4th or 5th purchase, I start to get fuzzy as to what I bought when. So I definitely feel you on that. I know James Couré Smith is doing the same thing with his blog, which started off on Substack and has since migrated. He was talking about Doctor Who shows in the order in which he discovered them. This podcast, of course, is going in publication order, and we are approaching the 2/3 mark. So it is good to get new guests in and hear some fresh blood. So before we talk about this week's book, The Mark of the Rani, let's talk about your fandom journey then. Did you discover the show on VHS, or did you discover the show on terrestrial airings and then start collecting the VHSs later?
I discovered them on the terrestrial airings. I would have watched the Sylvester McCoy era on broadcast. It would have been 4 when his first season debuted, and I have vague memories of Paradise Towers, but they're kind of jumbled with different parts of the story and completely different sets from completely different programs. Because for some reason, my memory of the TARDIS was the broom cupboard from Children's BBC, which was like the presenter part. Don't ask me why. And I remember the cleaner in the swimming pool being this ginormous thing, not this little yellow bath toy floating around. And I remember bits of Dragonfire, but I really remember it's really season 25 where I have the strongest memories. I remember most watching Remembrance of the Daleks onwards. And yeah, so there was Doctor Who was popular in my household. My mum and dad watched it. We usually watched it while we were having our evening meal. And family friends who in the morning would go off to work and drop us off with these out on our way to school. Then we'd walk to school with them, and they would usually be watching the episode from the night before when we got there in the morning. So I have very strong memories of season 25 and 26 from when they went out. Then I think would have been 1990. It was coming into my 3rd year in primary school, and I was to see it start something. Oh, Doctor Who should be back on now. I was beginning to tweet how the scheduling worked, and of course it never came back. So I thought, oh, it must have finished. And then I started getting interested in things like Thunderbirds and the repeats of the Munsters, because there used to be a vintage slot on BBC Two around 6 o'clock. And then they started that 1992 repeat season with the Time Meddler, and that's pretty much when I started getting to be a fan. I had previously been gifted the compilation VHS of Death to the Daleks, which I proudly kept trying to invite people to come around and see from school, and of course that made me the coolest person in the class, obviously.
It's funny that you mention the Munsters, because here in the States that was ubiquitous in reruns on cable TV, especially the Ted Turner channels in the mid to late 80s. So I was watching a lot of black and white sitcoms shortly before I discovered Doctor Who. So I've probably seen every episode of the Munsters, even if I don't have specific memories of most of them. Al Lewis, who played Grandpa Munster, longtime New Yorker, longtime sitcom legend, and he opened up an Italian restaurant on Bleecker Street in the West Village of Manhattan, not too far from where I work now, actually, in the 1980s. So it was Grandpa's Bella Gente, Grandpa's Beautiful People, Grandpa's Italian restaurant. And he actually showed up about halfway through the meal the one time we were there. And everyone, of course, applauded. I immediately ran over to him and tried to get his autograph. But the thing about the 1980s to remember is that this is back when every restaurant and bar still gave out their own proprietary matchbook. So I was probably 12 or 13 at the time, Grandpa tore all the matches out to discourage me from smoking and signed an empty matchbook for me. And I had that for years, and I probably lost it during a move somewhere. And Al Lewis lived to be like 100, and that was the only time that I met him. I don't remember him being very pleasant or polite about it, but I guess when you're his age, signing autographs is the last thing you want to do, especially in a matchbook.
I imagine not. Yes. I believe the Rum House, which is attached to the Hotel Edison, I think they still have their own little matchbooks as well. They certainly have their own pens. I might have acquired one or two while I was there.
When I had my bar mitzvah in 1986, my parents ordered personalized matchbooks to give away to the adult guests at the reception after the service. And I still have a bunch. I still have like 3 or 4 matchbooks that have my name on them. So if you're ever in the States again and you want to light up a cigarette out of a Jason matchbook, you are certainly more than welcome. Looking at it now, showing it to my kid, it's the most bizarre thing. Who gives out matchbooks monogrammed for a 13-year-old? I guess the 1980s were a strange decade.
Oh, there used to be a case in the UK is that you could purchase a single cigarette if you had a note from your mum. Because I'm saying it was for her, of course. Nobody took advantage of that whatsoever, would they?
I used to be dispatched to the cigarette vending machine. They used to have those in supermarkets in the early 80s, and my mother was a Kent smoker until she finally gave it up in the early 80s. Fortunately, before it would have any negative long-term effects on her health. She's still with us, 80 years old. But I used to know how to select her cigarettes and buy her cigarettes, and I vowed to myself, when I grow up, I'm going to smoke Kents. Fortunately, we didn't learn in first grade how bad smoking is for you, and my mom stopped shortly thereafter, so that's a bit of knowledge that I'll never use. The last time that I ever saw a cigarette vending machine in the wild would have been at a catering hall in New Jersey, probably about 10 years ago. I assume they had it there as a lark, and they weren't actively stocking it up with cigarettes anymore, but you never know. So if you see a cigarette vending machine in the wild, kids, do not buy cigarettes.
We used to have, in one of the pubs I worked in, we had a cigarette vending machine up until about 2008, and then new regulations came in, barring them from being used. And they were always self-help, so it's always how you're supposed to enforce that. I never quite figured that one out. And then you could have a vending machine behind the bar to be operated by a member of staff, and then they just phase them out, and you don't really see cigarettes for sale in pubs anymore. Some will sell cigars, but of course you can't smoke it. Smoking bans in force, so that's a dying breed. But I think that's more of your very old-fashioned sawdust and spittoon pubs where you wipe your feet on the way out.
Ha! Smoking was banned in indoor establishments in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg before he became a very short-lived presidential candidate about 20 years ago. So growing up, it was a fact of life that you would ask for the smoking or the non-smoking section in a restaurant. Heck, my high school, and this is, of course, ages 14 to 18, had a smoking section for the kids. Kids as young as 14 were allowed to smoke in high school as long as they did it during lunch break in a designated area just off the cafeteria. Trying to explain to my kid who's about to start high school next year that smoking was accepted and encouraged in my high school as late as the early 90s is something that she cannot wrap her head around.
I think it was my A-level college where there was a smoking area, but they didn't encourage people to smoke, which is a good thing.
Well, speaking of relics of the past, we have the displeasure of talking today about one of my least favorite seasons of the classic Doctor Who series, but this is probably, alongside the Two Doctors, Mark of the Rani is probably my favorite episode of that season. And there's stuff about it that I really don't like, which I guess we'll come to. But you had started watching the show shortly after season 22 aired in the wild. So when did you first see season 22, and what were your initial impressions of it?
Well, I would have watched it in disjointed order because it would have been mostly through VHS releases or possibly through reading and novelizations, but I can't really recall reading any of the season 22 novelizations off the top of my head. Definitely read all the Trial of the Time Lord books, not in sequence, so that was... I started off with Terror of the Vervoids, then went to the Mysterious Planet, then read The Ultimate Foe, and then read Mind Warp, purely because that is how they were available in the local libraries.
That's
But
how I learned about Perry's death. I bought the Terror of the Vervoids novelization, where Perry's death is mentioned on page 1, and I hadn't seen Trial of a Time Lord yet, so that was a shocker. And then, of course, as it turns out, she wasn't really dead at all, as is explained in 2 of the other 4 Trial of a Time Lord novelizations. But that was an unpleasant surprise while it lasted.
However, Mark of the Rani is one I did hire from the library, so I don't think I finished it all. I'm not sure if this was while I was reading it myself or if it was still at the point when my mother was reading them to me. But I don't think we finished it. But I remember it was the hardback copy, and the on the cover it's got the cage for the mine. I thought that was the TARDIS hanging off the mine wheel. That's how my little brain interpreted it.
You know what? I was today years old when I realized that is not the TARDIS. I always just assumed that's the TARDIS because it's a very TARDIS shape with the windows and everything.
No, it's a mine cage for lowering down the coal carts.
And then, of course, you have the Rani's TARDIS right in front of that, behind the Rani and in front of the not TARDIS. And the Rani's TARDIS is pretty cool looking.
Oh, yes. I like how they cleverly got around having to pay Kate O'Mara a copyright fees by just having her in the old crone makeup. So, yeah, Rani's on the cover, but it's not Kate O'Mara.
There's a lot going for this story. It's a pseudo-historical. It's the first time since the 1960s that a real-life individual is featured on the show, George Stevenson. It's got the Master, and I've had a greater and greater appreciation for Anthony Ainley the more I rewatch the classic series. And it's the first appearance of the Rani, probably the Rani's best story, to the point that to this day, whenever a new recurring female character with some mystery is mentioned on the new series of Doctor Who, even 40 years later, one of the first questions, is it the Rani? And we're seeing that now with the Mrs. Flood character in the new Russell T Davies series. Is it the Rani? So I guess we'll find out soon enough. But it's certainly a character who has quite a grip on fandom, even though she was only in the 2 televised stories and then Dimensions in Time.
I believe, yes. They've also touted the Rani for Jinx Monsoon's character. Is that the right name?
I'm trying to avoid spoilers, so I don't want to know who Jinx Monsoon is playing until her episode airs. But Jinx Monsoon is coming back to the boards in New York City and is going to be starring in the off-Broadway revival of Little Shop of Horror, playing literally off-Broadway in the West 40s. And that's got a rotating cast of celebrities every 2 months or so. And Jinx Monsoon is going to be playing the Audrey character, I believe, if memory serves me right.
Yes, they did a production of Little Shop of Horrors at my secondary school. I wasn't involved in that one, but I think they had Father Simon that was playing the plant, I think.
So a lot to like about Mark of the Rani, and then of course there's a lot to not like, thinking specifically of the tree won't hurt you, and yes, the perhaps not photorealistic Tyrannosaurus Rex prop at the very end. We try and suspend disbelief watching the classic series. These are special effects that are 40 years old, and I don't mind the dinosaur, but when you ask somebody what they don't like about Mark of the Rani, that dinosaur is always one of the first things that comes up. Poor devil.
Yeah. Yes, it's a lot better than the ones we see in Invasion of the Dinosaurs. So,
well, they had the advantage of making it 13 years later with all the attendant advances in special effects and stop motion. So, where do you rank Mark of the Rani in terms of season 22? One of the best, one of the worst, or just plain old average?
I'd probably say it's on the on the higher side of average. I'd say I'd probably rank Vengeance, Revelation, then the Mark of the Rani. I'd put it slightly ahead of the 2 Doctors, and then there's a yawning chasm between that, Attack of the Cybermen, and Time Lash.
Poor Time Lash. Time Lash is just never going to win. Now, we've talked about Time Lash on this show recently because we are in the middle of the season 22 books, coming out basically all at once, with the notable exception of Revelation of the Daleks. This is the first Doctor Who script penned by Pip Jane Baker. This is the first novelization penned by Pip and Jane Baker. I will be talking at length about their writing style in my audio essay, but as you're a first-time guest, I'm going to give you the honors of potentially preempting me. What do we say about the rather unique prose style of these two craftsmen of the literary arts?
Well, when reading this for the podcast, I noticed that they are very fond of commas, which is curious, which made me wonder, were they back in 1986 when they were thinking, one day this is going to be an audiobook. Let's see if we can get William Shatner to read it.
It's kind of like a Pinter play. Page
Yes.
80. Anticipating the Doctor's more circuitous route, comma, Ward, comma, familiar with every nook and cranny, comma, took a shortcut to the overhead track edged against the skyline, comma, period. Nimble as a cat, comma, he scaled the framework, comma, then lay in wait, period. Still trailing in the rear, comma, Perry was disgruntled, period. So, yeah, that's definitely almost a one-to-one comma-to-word ratio. I don't think that's a problem that Terrence Dix has.
No, it's certainly not. And they also like very short sentences as well. But when I was reading this, it stirred a little thought in my mind, and I went back into my extensive library of stuff, and it reminded me of some of the late 19th century, early 20th century stories which would appear in the Penny Pictorial or the Union Jack magazine. And this is from a story featuring a character called Sexton Blake, who was created by a man called Harold Meredith, whose real name was Harry Blythe, for the Halfpenny Marvel. He wrote 9 stories and he died of typhoid.
Oh.
Was it diphtheria? Anyway, he died of something unpleasant. And basically, Sexton Blake was the first story, The Missing Millionaire, was published about 6 weeks after the original publication of The Final Problem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, in which killed off Sherlock Holmes. So a new detective turns up, and he happens to later on in the run has digs in Baker Street. So these stories were aimed at a much younger audience. So it's Sherlock Holmes for kids, and they were often disparagingly called the office boy Sherlock Holmes. So that often means there's far less deductive reasoning and far more thumping. But the Sherlock Holmes reference, if you read them, isn't that strong. The more you read them, you think they're sort of Indiana Jones, Alan Quatermain sort of sounds. But I'm going to read you a little extraction from a story called The Man from Scotland Yard by a mysterious author who has possibly been identified as a gas fitter called Ernest Semple. So it's the first chapter, which is a very strange place, but it's number 13, Railway Street. Enjoyed it. So, number 13, comma, Railway Street, comma, enjoyed a unique reputation. Period. It had excited, comma, but never satisfied, comma, the curiosity of its neighbours. Period. And I begin to wonder, are Pip and Jane deliberately imitating this style and to try and fit in with the period the story is set in?
That's a very good thought, and I like that idea, except that their next 3 novelizations are going to do the same thing, and it's noticeably much more choppy than any other Doctor Who target novel of the era, or indeed any other Doctor Who novel that's come since. But you really perked up my ears when you said typhoid. That's a new sentence that I just said. But one of the sad facts of American history is that in the 1840s, the White House, the executive mansion where the president lives, was directly across the street from an open sewer. So 2 presidents died of typhoid within the same decade, but because they didn't want to admit that presidents were dying because of unsanitary conditions in the nation's capital and the seat of government, they lied about them. So most children, up until very recently, were told that William Henry Harrison died because he gave the longest inaugural address in history on a cold day in the rain while not wearing a hat. No, he died of typhoid. And then Zachary Taylor was said to have been riding around Washington, D.C. on his horse, He was an old war hero, riding around Washington, D.C. on his horse, and then he came back to the White House and had a meal of warm milk and frozen cherries. And this evidently gave him peritonitis, and he died. No, he died of typhoid. So it's one of these old-fashioned things. Tell me you live in the 19th century without telling me you live in the 19th century. I died of typhoid.
It's probably not something we should really laugh at, is it?
Not at all. But the fact that American historians just decided to completely lie about this and pretend that it didn't happen for a good century and a half is, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. Typhoid was a fact of life, so was cholera. But historians decided to lie about it to make us look not so barbaric.
Yes, I mean, there's lots of... Well, when I was at school, we did lots of stories about Victorian diseases in England. So we had an entire project on things like typhoid, cholera, and we had great fun at school. But just going back to Mark and Rani, is that one thing is that they do like to have words which children can go and look up and see what they mean. And I think that's a very deliberate point, styling on their choice, I think. It's particularly not, and they're clearly writing for Colin Baker's love of language as well.
Giving a shout out to Colin Baker, he has said this many times, the English language shrinks every year and a lot of words disappear forever. Of course, the flip side of that is that new words are invented to replace the ones that go away. But Colin liked to work in older, fancy vocabulary words whenever he could, one per story, which is how you come to have the word pusillanimous appearing in his first story, The Twin Dilemma. And I mentioned this back in my Twin Dilemma episode. I got big marks from my 7th grade English teacher for being the only student in the class who could pronounce pusillanimous. So heard of the word before, so it pays to enrich your word power. And that's a positive mark for Pip and Jane, I suppose. Although sometimes they appear to be overdoing it, and I will riff on that in my audio essay later in the hour. But
yes, I think there is the case of sometimes less is more.
When I first saw this story, it was probably in 1985 when the New Jersey PBS station got the Hartnell and Troughton and Colin Baker packages all at once. So they started airing these in late 1985, and they would air the Hartnells and Troughtons in order. But for the last Saturday night of every month, they would air one of the season 22s instead. So you would have Twin Dilemma in October, Attack of the Cybermen in November, and so on. So I would have seen Mark of the Rani in early 1986 when I was in the 7th grade. It was my first year of junior high school. I was pretty miserable with the harder work in junior high school. And when I was watching Mark of the Rani, watching the Doctor and the location footage in this story is gorgeous. And that was one of the first things that struck me about it. The Doctor walking around in broad daylight in the morning, solving a crime when I was spending all of my daylight hours in junior high school. I was intensely jealous of the 6th Doctor and Perry. That's a new sentence that nobody's ever said before. So that was my earliest memory of Mark of the Rani. Second thing is I knew in broad outlines what the Industrial Revolution was, but I'd never heard of George Stephenson. And especially at that age, I didn't have much context for what this story was about. This is how I learned about Luddites, I think. And eventually the story came to make more sense to me, but it was almost as alien as the alien worlds of The Vengeance on Varos or Time Lash. For me, an American 13-year-old watching, actually 12, watching this story in early 1986, before I turned 13. You, when you pitched this episode as the one you wanted to debut on for Doctor Who Lit, gave me some interesting historical context for Mark of the Rani. So what can you tell us about the background of this tale?
Well, like I said, it's set at the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the location which is filmed it is part of the Ironbridge Gorge Museum, and it's mostly filmed in Bliss Hill, but there's also some bits filmed at the China Museum, which geographically are right next to each other, but if you were visiting them, it's a little bit more complicated to get to each other. due to how the road works around that area. But it's literally just down the road from where I live, and it's down the road from where I grew up. So this would be a place, because one of the big things in English education, particularly at primary school, or what would you call the equivalent to primary school in the States? From education ages 5 up to 11. So
that would be elementary school.
That's the word. That's the word I was looking for. Victorian England is a major thing they push. So we'd go off and do a school trip to Bristol. So I got to go on the school trip to a Doctor Who location.
Oh, that's
amazing.
amazing.
Have mentioned once or twice while I was there.
Did you walk around in a floppy Tom Baker scarf or a Jim Sangster Doctor Who themed T-shirt and start speaking as if you were Colin Baker?
Well, I might have been a bit. Oh yes, dramatic, I suppose. But it's so obviously it's changed a bit since it was filmed there, and when I was going back to school, because part of it was destroyed in a landslide, so they had to rebuild it. And since then, and since they did the revisit for the DVD, it's been upgraded again. They've put a new street in, they've put some new frontages. And they've imported some new of the period steam engines. But another curious thing is, if you go into the museum, there's an old Victorian schoolhouse, and the schoolhouse used to be situated outside my old house, and they took it down brick by brick and rebuilt it in Bliss Hill. So when I was growing up, it's where the Industrial Revolution started. Ironbridge is where the first Ironbridge was built by Abraham Darby, the school named after him. And Town Park, where we'd go and play as kids, they used to mine clay and coal, and where we'd be playing around in the woods, there's remnants of an old crusher where they'd crush the clay down and fire it up to be made into bricks. And there's a chimney which was from an ultimately unused blast furnace, which is regularly on my dog walks. And one of the places I used to play was a re-welded slag heap from the mining times, and so we could literally say, "Oh, I'm up on the slag heap with my mates."
In the legal profession, we call that the attractive nuisance. You must have tons of injuries from children playing on abandoned 200-year-old industrial equipment and slag heaps. That can't be good for you.
No, it's literally been grown into a forest. Has been grown to a forest. They've had put steps in, so they stabilised it a long time ago. And there's a walking route called the Silken Way, which is basically a major connecting point from Ironbridge, Bridge North, all the way up to Wellington. And it used to be a train route for bringing the coal back and forth. And in the town park, on the Silken Way, they've recreated one of the old stations. The original brickwork was there, and they've just restored it into what it looked like then, brand new. And one of the pools where I walked by used to be where they mined the ore for the clay from, and that's been turned into a pool, but they left all the old mining equipment there. It's all in there under the mud.
Huh.
And it's called the blue pool because of the chemical, the mineral content from the clay. It gives it a very blue shine, more than you would normally see in the lake. And so, as I said, the Urban Elbe Museum, you go there, they have different sorts of demonstrations every day. One day you'll have somebody doing the blacksmiths. There'll be a preacher, usually on Sundays. And they even have this Victorian fairground where you can do the coconut shy, go on to merry-go-rounds with, and people always in period costume, trying to speak in period, not always very successfully. But the only thing of recent is they've put up a new sort of mining exhibit when you go in a little mining cart, and it gives you a shadow play about working in the mines. Unfortunately, for health and safety reasons, that has to be made out of corrugated iron, so it can be even taken down in a hurry if there's a problem. which kind of ruins the verisimilitude.
We do have living museums like that in the United States. There's mostly harking back to colonial times in Williamsburg, Virginia, and then there's one on Long Island, not too far from where I grew up, the Old Westbury Village Restoration. So you have actors walking around in period costume and playing tour guides and sometimes putting on old-timey accents. But thinking more broadly, since we are still at the tail end of the 60th anniversary festivities, I'm going to go through my 3 Darren Mooney questions with you, thinking about Doctor Who's top 60 for 60. Does Mark of the Rani belong on a list of the 60 greatest Doctor Who TV stories ever made?
No, I don't think it does.
Not a whole lot from season 22 that I would put on there, and is not on the list that I came up with for the 60 for 60 last year. But of course, there is a difference between greatest or best and your favorites, personal favorites. Would Mark of the Rani be on your list of your 60 favorite Doctor Who stories of all time?
Unfortunately, it is not. And unfortunately for Colin, none of his stories made it to my top 60. He has the ignominious position of being the only Doctor not to be represented, not including everything after the Power of the Doctor, of course.
See, Fraser Gregory got around this by including all of Trial of a Time Lord as one story and putting it on his list.
I think he did the same with Flux, didn't he?
I believe so. If this is the final of the 3 Darren Mooney questions, if someone has not yet seen Mark of the Rani, and of course that's a big if because this podcast essentially appeals to the old school, people who've already memorized the episode, even the bad ones, the bad episodes. If someone has not seen Mark of the Rani, do you recommend that they pause the podcast, stream Mark to a local device, or purchase the season 22 Blu-ray, watch it, watch all the extras, and then come back and finish out this episode?
I would definitely recommend that they go purchase the Blu-ray, watch part 1, then read the novelization through to the end, because then you'll when you get to a certain point in the narrative, you're thinking, that's what they're going for, and that's not what's on screen.
Give us
and
an
that is the
example.
point I'll bring up a little bit later.
So how does the novelization, and this is not going to be impinging on my audio essay because I'm more concerned with the pro style, how does the novelization diverge from what we saw on television?
It doesn't do a huge amount of diversion in terms of storylining. It's based on the original draft, so there's some stuff mostly involved, the sequences with column, bits which were trimmed for timing, which aren't on the TV screen, on the TV's version. But there's some dialogue references, such as, I think Sayward edited some of the dialogue between the Doctor and the Rani about the Master. In the novelization, they say he still thinks he's tiny. And he's corrected that in the TV script to be saying, I think he was burnt to a crisp last time I saw him. But there's a little, when it comes to the to Luke Ward's fate, it's a little bit more gruesome, got a little bit more body horror, and which is what they were going for, rather than the pantomime tree which they had on the screen.
There's a lot of body horror running throughout season 22, and we can certainly credit Eric Sayward with this, because you have the on-screen real-time cyber conversions in Attack, you have Perry being turned into a bird in Vengeance, you have the Second Doctor being turned into an androgum, and Jamie being nearly vivisected in The Two Doctors, and then you have the Borat, who is the horrific amalgamation of a mad scientist and a Morlocks in Time Lash. So Mark's contribution to that is, of course, the tree won't hurt you. But like you say, the pantomime tree sort of defies credulity.
It doesn't. So if I may, I'm going to just read the passage how it describes it in the book.
Go for it.
So, when they did, 2 arms were raised in supplication, and a brown and corrugated torso was surmounted by swirls and knots that faintly resembled Luke's face. Now, this description brought back another childhood memory, and it brought back to a memory of a reading scheme series of books called Tim and the Hidden People, which were published between the 70s and early 80s. And one of these stories was called The Stump People. And they were tree-like people, and that description made me think of the illustrations. So I wonder if Pip and Jane Baker had been looking at things, what the children might have been reading at school, and were referencing that.
So that's the second time you've noticed in this podcast that Pip and Jane appear to be consciously echoing either children's literature or penny dreadfuls of a bygone era, which is great. I really encourage novelizations that do that, because you don't want to be just reading a transcript of a TV episode. You want the author's personality to shine through, so you want those classical references and allusions. The more obscure, the better.
I think it's Pip and Jane Baker. They wrote quite a bit of children's television. They did a couple of series on a show called What on Earth. That's what, as in the electric WATT. It was about an alien who came to Earth to observe the humans. It's like a kids' comedy, and he got integrated with the family, and was talking to the little boy there, and he would turn into something like a golf ball or an egg cup when he thought he was going to be discovered. And of course his sister thought, oh, my brother started talking to himself. But every time he'd change into something, it'd be a bit wrong. So he'd turn into a golf ball and it'd be shaped like an egg.
Huh.
So I think Pip and Jane were very conscious of writing for a child audience, but not talking down to them. And I think what I will say in favour of the Mark of the Rani on TV and in novelisation, where it succeeds, where season 22 does not, is it remembers the child audience. Once you start ignoring the child audience for Doctor Who, it starts to go a bit pear-shaped. It's all very good having your revelation of the Daleks, but that's got to be the exception. It might be the same thing with Moffat season 9. It does seem to neglect the child audience. You could argue Chibnall's Who also perhaps did that a little bit. Where, say, RTD is remembering the kids. We got the beat the meat. We've got catchphrases they can repeat in the playground and whatnot. So I think it's a very important thing to what Pip and Jane Baker are doing. And again, when they do Time in the Rani, they were doing references to Solomon's wisdom and again they get so I think that's important to them.
Well, I can't envision a world in which children are playing Mark and the Rani in the schoolyard, but if any of you, my Doctor Who literature army of ghastly woke zombies, if any of you in the 1980s were running around pretending to step on landmines and turn into trees and were calling across the yard, "The tree won't hurt you," please let me know, and I will feature your reminiscence on a later episode of Doctor Who literature. Much later. I have two general questions that I want to ask you. These were both proposed by producer Jim Sangster. And I'll debut the new question first. You'll be the first one to answer it, and it will be a feature on the show for the foreseeable future. If someone has not read a Doctor Who novelization before and is being introduced to the series, is the Mark of the Rani novelization a good starting off point? Is this a good first Doctor Who book you ever read recommendation?
No, I don't think it's a good first one. It does require you to know a little bit about the series. It's got continuity references to Gallifrey, which don't really make sense if you don't know what they're all about. It may be written for children, but it's clearly it's written for children who know the series. So no, I wouldn't say it is.
And I would add to that, the prose style, I'm not going to call it off-putting, but it is
unique.
An acquired taste. Yes, unique. That's a good word, too. So it's not indicative of the rest of the line, but we haven't gotten to Time and the Rani on this show. That comes out quite a bit later, so it'll be several months before we discuss it here. In Time and the Rani, the Doctor reflects back to this story Or maybe it wasn't the time of the running. Maybe it was one of their season 23 books. I don't remember which. We'll come to it in due course. But Pip and Jane specifically have the Doctor recall the story and mention that he had named the adventure the Mark of the Rani, which they then said in italics. So that is reminiscent of the Hardy Boys, speaking of classic American children's literature, where they always mentioned the name of the previous book in italics, and on the last or second to last page, Frank and Joe didn't know it yet, but they were soon to have the most terrifying adventure of their lives in the adventure of the flickering torch, or that sort of thing. So having the Doctor refer mentally to a previous adventure by its episode title in italics is a callback to, intentional or otherwise, children's literature that I certainly appreciated back in the day. And it's kind of embarrassing that as much as I've read the Hardy Boys, I had to think for a minute to come up with an actual Hardy Boys book title to mention as an example. It was the Flickering Torch Mystery, by the way, not the Adventure of the Flickering Torch.
I seem to recall there was also a Hardy Boys adventure called The Edge of Destruction.
That would not have been one of the classic original 58 books from the original hardcover line. But that would be, I don't recall any Hardy Boys titles that overlap Doctor Who titles, but there were a lot of Hardy Boys paperbacks that came out in the 80s, which I did not read. So maybe that was one of them.
Well, it could be if it was a British edition, it'd have a different title.
No, the Stratemeyer Syndicate was a wonderful thing for children, and the Hardy Boys are still around. There was a TV adaptation a couple of years ago. My daughter's name comes from the Hardy Boys, so this is not a Hardy Boys podcast, but I'm going to take that opportunity to Google that right now. And, of course, nothing is more exciting than listening to somebody Google something on a podcast. If you have any other points to raise about Mark of the Rani, this is the time to do it.
Yes. My interest is that, from a British point of view, when I first watched it on the VHS release in the mid to late 90s, it was towards the tail end of the painted covers before they went over to Black Sheep and that horrible swirl. And the opening scene, it's got that lovely theatrical. We're in the Victorian age, and what strikes me is, this probably will mean absolutely nothing to you, is that Jonathan Gibbs' score is a sort of synth implication of the Largo from the New World Symphony, otherwise known as Going Home. But we got this people covered in coal in sort of scraggy clothes. It must have made every single person of a certain age in the UK think of the old Hovis advert, which had the New World Symphony accompanying this advert of a Victorian dressed man covered in scalders pushing his Victorian bike up the hill with bread in the basket, and then showing it over the ages, but still those old buildings getting slightly modern.
And you are correct. It was the Hardy Boys Case File series, which were mass market direct paperbacks that came out starting in the late 80s, and it ran for, I think, over 100 books. This was after I outgrew the Hardy Boys and after I was even starting to outgrow the Target novelizations for the first time. So this is number 5 in the Hardy Boys Case File series, and it comes out in July 1987. Blurb on the back of the book. In the middle of a gala political banquet, Fenton Hardy is kidnapped. Then a mysterious caller outlines his terrifying demand. Unless he receives $20 million, Fenton Hardy, along with many thousands of innocent victims, will be infected with a fatal virus. New York City will turn into a ghost town. Police Chief Sam Peterson, Hardy's ex-partner in the NYPD, immediately takes charge. His first official act is to order Frank and Joe off the case, but the brother detectives are far too worried about their father to heed the chief's warning, even if it means entering a strange underground world far below the city streets. A world where darkness rules, the mob is the only law, and murder lurks behind every shadow. Now, New York City itself is a city of 8 million people, not counting the greater metropolitan area, so thousands of innocent victims is a gross underestimate. Of course, we are also recording this in early March, 4 years to the week after COVID began to affect life in New York City and kill many thousands of New Yorkers, so that comes a little bit close to home. I am not positive that the person who wrote this book under the pen name Franklin W. Dixon, and the wiki doesn't tell us who the actual author would have been. Not positive that person would have been a Doctor Who fan, but it would be neat to read this book and see if there are any subtle shout-outs to the Doctor Who episode Edge of Destruction, which had already aired in the New York area on PBS long before July 1987 when this paperback comes out. Maybe there's a connection. We'll never know. If you are the author of the Hardy Boys Case Files number 5, Edge of Destruction, please reach out to me.
I think it's likely a happy coincidence, because I think there's also a Nancy Drew story called The Twin Dilemma. So I might have dreamt that one up.
Well, again, that's probably more likely the Bobbsey Twins, which was also an Edward Stratemeyer Syndicate series. But again, based on the theory that nothing is more exciting than listening to a man Google things on a podcast. Nancy Drew, Twin Dilemma. Heavens to Betsy, you did it again. The Twin Dilemma is the 63rd volume in the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories series. It was first published in 1981 under the author's pseudonym Carolyn Keene. Ghost written by Nancy Axelrod. So 1981. So the Nancy Drew Twin Dilemma comes out 3 years before the Doctor Who Twin Dilemma. So maybe Anthony Stephen or Eric Saber were taking their cues from Nancy Drew. Although I highly doubt it.
No. Going back to Mark, why is there's very good use of northern working class dialogue. They refer to raising the Tobies when they go down to the pub or. And I was wondering, do you have any problems getting through the thick accents? Because I watched it with my ex-partner a long time ago, and she couldn't always make out what Stevenson was saying. And
I struggled to understand it the first time that I saw this in 1986, but it didn't bother me because I knew about the broad range of UK accents. And I probably would have heard similar accents in other Doctor Who episodes, even if not quite that thick. Novelization would have been helpful in helping me to understand what the words meant, but of course, the Bakers are choosing to write in dialect. But the rest of the prose is so choppy that I think it actually fits. I think that old-time dialect written with lots of contractions and apostrophes, I think it actually fits the style of the book.
Yes, I think it does.
So we're wrapping up our conversation on Mark of the Rani, and of course my audio essay will follow in a few minutes' time. But as I mentioned earlier, as I was introducing you, you have racked up an impressive number of other podcast guest appearances, some of which have already been recorded and released, some of which are still in the planning stages following the invite. What are some of the other shows where we can find you? Because this is most certainly not your podcast debut, even if it is your Doctor Who Lit debut.
Yes, well, you can find my podcast debut over on Ian Martin's We're All Stories in the End, in which I talk about the 8th Doctor novel, Dark Progeny, which was written by Steve Emerson. And it was one of the few 8th Doctor books I didn't read on first publication. So that was a new experience for me. And it will be coming up on Dylan Reese's Too Hot for TV, where I'll be discussing Corpse Marker and by Chris Boucher and the Caldor City play Storm Mine. And I'm also lined up for Strictly Come Hamster with Joe Ford and Rod, and we'll be discussing. Well, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say it, so you might have to edit it, but we'll be discussing Christopher Eccleston's season.
I'd never even heard of that podcast until you mentioned it, so that's a new one on me. But I did a guest spot on All Stories in the End a little over a year ago, covering Camera Obscura, another 8th Doctor adventure. Ian is going in alphabetical order, so my appearance is now in the distant past because he's already up to the D's. And friend of this show, longtime contributor Conrad, was actually on Too Hot for TV a couple of months ago talking about The Ghost of Endspace. Excellent episode that I thoroughly enjoyed and immediately sent Conrad fan mail after I'd heard it.
Yes, I listened to that one. It was very good, yes.
Looking forward to your appearance on Too Hot for TV as well, even if I struggle with Chris Boucher's prose And
Yes,
I've read all 4 of his past Doctor adventures, but he doesn't have the most exciting prose style. He tends to write in very long scenes, and there's a lot of good set pieces, but the prose is sometimes a little bit of an acquired taste. Not quite as acquired a taste as Pip and Jane Baker, but
no.
he's not my favorite prose stylist for sure.
Yes, I don't think he took to prose very well. It's clear this is a script editor turning to prose. A script writer, I should say, not script editor. And I do somewhere along the line will be appearing on Cy Hart's podcast sometime in the distant future. So I think he got a bigger response to his call out than he expected. So that'll be interesting. And I think I'll be on. Joe Ford did get in touch with me about to go on Hamster with a Blunt Penknife, which I'll be talking about one of the Matt Smith episodes, which is not his favourite era, but it's one of my favourite eras. And again, I've got a rather tangible connection with the Matt Smith era. So,
Well, I'm looking forward to working you back into the very crowded Doctor Who literature schedule before this podcast, I should say, reaches its natural end and becomes something else, probably early in 2025. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. And
it's very nice of you to have me.
Thank you for wearing the ghastly woke zombie t-shirt. We want to sell as many of those as possible because that is Jim's online store. And where else might people be able to find you on the internet?
Okay, you'll be able to find me on Twitter at SammanJazz, Michael Storm. I'm also Michael Storm and Samman Jazz on Blue Sky, and I'm the Sentimental Sandman, Michael Storm, on Threads.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Doctor Who, The Mark of the Rani, by Pip and Jane Baker, televised as The Mark of the Rani, teleplay by Pip and Jane Baker, televised in February 1985, paperback release date June 12, 1986, target book number 107, cover artist Andrew Skilleter. En route to Kew Gardens, the Doctor and Perry are more than a little surprised when they land in the middle of a slag heap in England at the time of the Luddite uprisings. Unknown to the Doctor, his TARDIS has been dragged off course by the Master, who plans to destroy his arch-enemy once and for all and pervert the course of history. But also present is the Rani, another exile from Gallifrey, who is conducting her own evil experiments on the humans of the 19th century. Soon the Doctor discovers that the female of the species is far, far deadlier than the male. This is the way Pip and Jane Baker write. This is how they write. Sentence fragments. Other sentence fragments. Lots of exclamation points. More exclamation points than in comic book dialogue bubbles. And each wordy sentence is plunged into a wide array of flowery adjectives. The verbose authors allow not a single word to go by without extra adjectives being placed in front of each single noun. There are ellipses too, ... The Bakers like to end many of their sentences, ... and paragraphs, ... and chapters, ... with ellipses, ... such that the ellipses probably take up 40% of the character count, ... And oh, the florid wordsmithery! It's fair to say, without the tiresome need to vexatiously adumbrate each especial usage of profoundly antediluvian vocabulary, that the connubial pair of Whovian authors are exceedingly fond of plucking archaic nouns and verbs from high atop the celestial orb. For those of us from Earth, that means, boy, do those two wacky kids really use too many SAT words. I mean, they say things like, a predatory holler confirmed the Doctor's declaration, which is great for enriching your word power, but sometimes direct and spare prose and varied sentence structures does a better job of propelling along your narrative. One exception to my complaint about the words is the use of capacious, an old friend to longtime readers of the target line. Sometimes the Bakers will turn to the audience. They will tell you, the reader, directly, something that the Doctor hasn't figured out yet. More subtle is their teasing that something bad, capital B, is going to happen to Luke, because after Stevenson says that Luke is going to outshine him, the Doctor and Perry frown, because they're from the future, and they know that he doesn't, and won't. You know what else Pip and Jane like to do? Did you notice they ask a lot of questions? Quote, Rani? He knew her? This withered old crone? Old crone? Now, I ask you, isn't that a lot of questions? Why are there so many question marks in this book? Why? Does the rain fall from up above? Why do fools fall in love? Why do they fall in love? Question mark. And characters don't talk in the Mark of the Rani. There's no he said, she said. No, here characters jibe, they chunter. In fact, they chunter twice. The book is made up of very short chapters, 20, far more than Terence's usual 12, and a 2-paragraph prologue, and a not much longer epilogue. This is the James Patterson School of Fiction. I mean, it's more readable than last week's Turlough and the Earthling Dilemma, if nothing else. The Bakers also betray something of an unfamiliarity with Doctor Who continuity. They place Perry as coming from New England, USA, while the previous books localized her to New York. A later book will localize her to California, and the 2023 streaming specials, Tales from the TARDIS, will localize her to the Fells Point neighborhood of Baltimore, where I used to live. I suspect the New England bit is because the Bakers were trying to explain away Perry's sometimes British accent, and there was a time, up until the 1960s, when there was a so-called mid-Atlantic accent in the northeastern U.S., which did faintly resemble the British accent. They say the United States of America would not have, quote, become one nation without George Stephenson's invention of the train, except that the U.S. Constitution was ratified about 30 years before Mark of the Rani takes place, so that's more of a philosophical point than a literal one. Pip and Jane also have the Doctor dangling from a rope over a bottomless pit. Wonder what it would be like to fall to his death, and whether or not his lives would flash before his eyes. Except, that's exactly what happened in Legopolis. Episode 72 of this podcast? Remember? Question mark. And yes, that's exactly what did already happen. ... Now, while it's easy to make fun of the Bakers' predilection for tortured verbiage, there are times when they drop the pretenses and get right to the point, with sometimes eloquent and almost spare prose, possibly by accident. For one grumpy minor character, the world is, quote, infested by enemies. For the Rani, quote, her most striking feature was her eyes, 2 glittering sapphires. They projected an icy calculation, unflawed by compassion. They slyly point out that, quote, physical dexterity was not the Doctor's greatest attribute in this present regeneration. Although, to be fair, Season 22 was Colin at his most physically dexterous. The larger and slower Colin of popular imagination didn't start to happen until after the hiatus, which we haven't gotten to yet in publication order. Also better is when the Bakers juxtapose natural beauty with the antagonist's failure to recognize the same. After a long passage extolling the beauty of Red Ferndale, where Luke becomes a tree in one of the classic series' more unfortunate narrative twists, the Bakers tell us that, quote, it could have been a desolate crater on the moon, for all the Rani and the Master saw.
No! An accident. It wasn't intended for him.
And you're so warped, so callous, you think that justifies it? First you turn an innocent young man into your acolyte, force him to betray his friends, and then you do this monstrous thing to him.
Oh, stop being sentimental. What's happened? Animal matter has been metamorphosed into vegetable matter, so what?
You'll be telling me next he's better off.
As a matter of fact, he is. A tree has 4 times the life expectancy of a human being.
They should never have exiled you. They should have locked you in a padded cell. Now move, before I forget my abhorrence of violence and use this.
At other times, though, the Bakers miss the point. As I write this from the year 2024, as the world is being strangled and burned to death by the rapacity of late-stage capitalism, I was hoping to find the Bakers more critical of Lord Ravensworth, the paternalistic lord of the manor who owns the village in which the story is set. But he's passed off as an ally of the Doctor, his actions never questioned. He reflects on his employees' insubordination, end quote, and crass insolence, end quote, and the writers give him a free pass. The Bakers do milk humor out of the constant sniping between the Rani and the Master. They even have the Master briefly ogling the Rani in her skin-tight costume, which is not necessarily in character for the Anthony Ainley Master, though to be fair, it is something villains generally do in other fiction. As the book proceeds, a reader is grateful for the short chapters, but the verbiage becomes tiresome. Here are some less felicitous examples. Quote, "Nevertheless, the Doctor's condescending stoicism was beginning to rankle. The Master pressed the vermilion tabs of the scanner." Or, "The cycloid discs, with a radius of 30 centimeters, bulged in the middle, where a digital detonator sensor obtruded. The enigma was, what malevolent genie waited to be unleashed?" So why in the end do I like The Mark of the Rani, the novelization? Check that. For what reasons is my encumbered soul so desirous of chanting out the praises of this slim antediluvian volume printed in the millennium before that in which I write? For one thing, context is everything. Reading the target books in story order, which is not what this podcast does, but is what many other readers do, Mark of the Rani breaks up a long string of unfortunate books. The, in my opinion at least, misfired Douglas Adams parody of the Twin Dilemma, the energetic but nihilistic Attack of the Cybermen, which is yet to come, the soul-black plottings and endless compound and run-on sentences of Vengeance on Varos, also yet to come. Mark of the Rani was a TV story with good dialogue and a mostly genial storyline. The writers here are having fun, and their writing style is, at least, not like anything else we'd seen in the target line to date. Not every book should be like this, but it's nice to have a different style, at least for 1 month, and for all the burden of the vocabulary, at least you'll learn a few new words, like Michael Storm mentioned earlier, and the grammar and syntax is a welcome improvement after what Philip Martin put us through in the novelization of the previous story. Though, of course, in publication order, the Martin book is coming out 2 years late, so it'll be months before we have to cover it on this program. Months. And for that, be thankful. Next time, on Doctor Who Literature, a 2-part Peter Davis story of which I am very, very fond, and I'll point you to my recent appearance on the Trap 1 episode covering the Season 20 Blu-ray box set. I don't just like next week's book because of the song, but I do like that Jim Sangster is back in the house with some more musical stylings, and we're going to talk about a bonus-length novelization of a short 2-part TV story. Next week, Jim and I will sing in praise of The King's Demons. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. This podcast is produced by David Barsky, Jim Sangster, and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Michael Storm, and special thanks, of course, to Kevin from Columbus for his contribution to this episode. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.